Title: The Academy of Hidden Powers. A faint tingling sensation ran through the cold morning air as Elara made her way down the narrow, moss-covered path that led deep into the forest. Her heart beat faster than usual, for today was the day she had been waiting for. Today, she would finally find out whether she was truly special or if the strange occurrences that had followed her for years were nothing but coincidence. It had all started on her 10th birthday, when she first realized she could sense things others couldn't perceive. It wasn't anything big, just a whisper in the shadows or a soft vibration when she ran her hand over old objects. Her parents dismissed it as her imagination, but her grandmother had given her a mysterious smile. "You're like your mother, my dear," she had said, "and one day you'll understand." But her mother had never been there to explain. She had disappeared when Elara was only 4 years old, and since then, her name had become taboo in the family. No one spoke of her, and the more Elara asked, the more her grandmother evaded the questions. Now, on her 15th birthday, something had finally happened. On a rainy night, a letter had arrived. Not just any letter, but one that nearly made her fall out of her chair. The letter was written in an ever-shifting script and bore the seal of an institution she'd never heard of, the Academy of Hidden Powers. The invitation. Dear Elara, it has come to our attention that you possess extraordinary abilities. If you are ready to face the unknown, follow the path of the old moon. It will lead you to us. There, you will learn more. There was no signature, no sender, just those few cryptic lines. Yet something about the words stirred something deep within her. Though her grandmother initially protested, she eventually nodded with a resigned expression, as if she had been expecting this. She handed Elara an old, worn key and a piece of advice. Trust your instincts, but be careful. Not everything that shines leads to the light. And so, here she was, walking through the misty depths of the forest as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The path of the old moon was no ordinary trail. It wasn't marked on any map and could only be seen if one looked closely, like silvery threads weaving through the trees. Elara followed the shimmering trail until she reached a clearing that took her breath away. Before her stood a gate made of gleaming metal, entwined with ivy that seemed to move of its own accord. Inscribed on the gate were the words, Shah, only those who see the invisible may enter. The gate's test. Elara glanced around. There was no one else in sight, and the gate had no visible door or handle. Then her eyes fell on the key in her hand. It seemed to pulse faintly in the morning light, almost as if it were alive. She held it up to the gate and immediately felt a strange warmth radiating through her fingers. The gate began to glow, and a soft whisper filled the clearing, a sound that was both comforting and unsettling. It was as if dozens of voices were speaking at once, though none of the words were understandable. Elara felt an unshakable urge to act. Closing her eyes, she focused on the whispers. Suddenly, she understood. They weren't words, but images forming in her mind. She saw the outline of a door hidden within the gate, invisible to those who didn't know where to look. Her heart pounding, she placed her hand on the spot she had seen in her mind. The gate vibrated briefly before opening with a gentle creak. Beyond the gate lay a sight that defied description. A vast, majestic academy nestled in a valley, surrounded by cascading waterfalls and floating islands that seemed to defy gravity. The sky here was brighter, the air crisper, and Elara felt instantly that she had stepped into a realm far removed from the ordinary world. The first encounter. Before Elara could take another step, a voice called out behind her. "You made it. I wasn't sure you had the guts." She spun around to see a boy, perhaps a year or two older than her. He had dark, curly hair, a mischievous grin, and wore a cloak that billowed in the wind, though the air was completely still. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice more cautious than she intended. "I'm Kieran. And before you ask, yes, I was new here once too. Come on, before you get overwhelmed with questions. The others are waiting." "Others?" Elara asked, but Kieran had already turned and started walking down the slope. She hesitated for a moment before following him. The farther they walked, the more the academy revealed its wonders. Shimmering towers, intricately carved arches, and strange creatures flitting through the air or darting between the trees. At last, they reached a grand plaza in front of the main entrance, where a small group of teenagers had gathered. They looked as though they came from entirely different worlds. A girl with fiery eyes and a cloak that seemed to flicker like flames. A tall boy with a strange, stone-like creature perched on his shoulder. And another girl engrossed in a book that hovered just above her hand. Kieran quickly introduced everyone, but Elara barely had time to catch their names before a deep, commanding voice rang out. "Welcome to the Academy of Hidden Powers." Everyone turned, and Elara saw a tall figure with long silver hair and a cloak that shimmered like molten gold. It was the headmaster, and his gaze seemed to pierce straight into her soul. "You are all here because you are exceptional," he said. "But never forget, great power comes with great peril. The secrets of this academy are older and more powerful than you can imagine, and not all of you will pass the trials ahead." The beginning of an adventure. A mix of fear and excitement surged through Elara. She knew she had just taken her first step into a world full of wonder and danger. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The world beyond the gates of the academy. The world that unfolded beyond the gates of the academy was far greater and more mysterious than Elara could have imagined. As she followed the headmaster and the small group of new students into the main hall, she could hardly take her eyes off the strange and fascinating sights around her. Paintings on the walls moved as though alive, and whispered voices echoed from the shadows, as if invisible beings were sharing secret messages. The main hall itself was a breathtaking sight. It was enormous, so vast that the ceiling was lost somewhere in the mist. Chandeliers made of floating crystals cast a soft, silvery light over long tables and towering bookshelves that stretched up to the heavens. On a raised platform stood a podium, from which the headmaster now gazed down at them. "This will be your home for the coming years," he began, his deep, resonant voice filling the hall. "The Academy of Hidden Powers is not merely a school. It is a place of learning, of growth, and of protection. For beyond these walls, forces exist that are beyond our control, and sometimes they come closer than we would like." A nervous murmur ran through the group of new students, but the headmaster raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. "You will learn to master your abilities. You will learn to control them, and to use them to protect yourselves in this world. But be warned, not everyone who enters this academy is prepared for what lies ahead. Some of you will fail. Others will have to decide where their true loyalties lie." Elara felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't sure if it was the headmaster's words or the strange look in his eyes that made her uneasy. But before she could dwell on it, a woman with copper-colored hair and a shimmering cloak stepped forward and began calling out the names of the new students. "Elara Winterthorn," she called at last, and Elara hesitantly stepped forward. The woman smiled warmly at her, and Elara suddenly felt a bit more at ease. "Come with me, Elara," the woman said. "I'll take you to your quarters." The quarters and hidden secrets. Elara was led down a long corridor illuminated by flickering lanterns. The shadows dancing along the walls seemed almost alive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Finally, they stopped in front of a heavy wooden door adorned with a silver emblem, an owl clutching a key in its talons. "This is your room," the woman said with a smile. "Every student has their own quarters. You'll find everything you need inside. But remember, the academy has its own rules. Some doors will only open when you're ready, and some should never be opened." Elara nodded silently and stepped inside. The room was larger than she had expected, with a canopy bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the shimmering lake behind the academy. But what truly captured her attention was the bookshelf that took up an entire wall. The books on it looked ancient, and as Elara approached, she noticed that some of the titles were written in a language she didn't understand. One book in particular stood out. It was bound in dark leather, with the same emblem as the door to her room, a key-clutching owl, engraved on the cover. Hesitantly, she pulled it out and opened it. The pages were blank, except for the first, where elegant handwriting read, "Knowledge is the key, but the key is hidden." Elara frowned. Before she could ponder the meaning of the phrase, a soft scratching sound caught her attention. It was coming from a corner of the room. She turned to find a small chest half hidden beneath the bed. Cautiously, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a small silver pendant in the shape of an owl, glowing faintly in the dim light. The moment Elara held the pendant, she felt a strange pull as though something was tugging at her. The world around her began to flicker, and suddenly she was no longer in her room. The hidden archive. Elara found herself in a dark chamber bathed in an eerie blue glow. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, bottles, and strange artifacts. In the center of the room stood an ancient stone table, upon which a map was spread out. "You've arrived sooner than I expected," said a voice, making Elara jump. She turned to see a figure cloaked in black so dark it seemed to swallow the light. The figure's face was hidden, but the voice sounded oddly familiar. "Who are you?" Elara asked, her heart racing. "Someone searching for answers, just like you," the figure replied. "But the right answers aren't found by asking questions. They're found by taking action." Before Elara could respond, the figure raised a hand and the map on the table began to glow. Strange symbols and lines appeared, forming a complex pattern. "This is the key to what you seek. But be warned, some secrets are meant to remain hidden." The figure disappeared, and Elara suddenly found herself back in her room, the pendant still in her hand. But now she knew one thing for certain: the academy was no ordinary place, and whatever she was destined to uncover here, it would change her life forever. Elara sat on her bed for a long time, the silver pendant in her hand. Her thoughts raced. Who had the figure been? And what did the map mean? Was it a puzzle she needed to solve, or a warning she should heed? A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. The door creaked open slightly, and Kieran's mischievous face appeared. "Well, are you ready? The orientation's about to start. You don't want to miss your first day, do you?" Elara hastily tucked the pendant into her pocket and stood up. "Orientation? What are you talking about?" Kieran grinned. "The ceremony of lights. It's the official start of your life here. Trust me, you don't want to be the one who shows up late." The ceremony of lights. Elara followed Kieran through the academy's long, winding corridors. The walls were adorned with tapestries that seemed to move as they passed. Figures on them winked at her, and at one moment, Elara was certain that one of them smiled. The path led to a vast hall with a towering, transparent ceiling. The night sky above was clear, filled with stars that shone brighter than Elara had ever seen. In the center of the hall stood a large fountain, from which poured a silvery light. It wasn't ordinary light. It seemed alive, pulsing as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The new students, about 20 in total, gathered around the fountain. A figure stepped forward, the headmaster. His golden robe shimmered in the light, and his gaze seemed to pierce each and every one of them. "Welcome," he began, his deep, resonant voice echoing in the hall. "You are now part of the Academy of Hidden Powers. But this is not merely a place of learning. It is a place of trials, a place where truth is revealed, and where your true selves will emerge." He paused, and Elara felt the tension in the air grow. "The ceremony of lights is more than a ritual," he continued. "It is the moment when the Academy acknowledges you, or rejects you." A nervous murmur spread through the group, but the headmaster raised his hand, and silence fell instantly. "One by one, you will step forward to the fountain. You will touch the light, and it will test you. It will see your strength, your intentions, and your fears. Be prepared." Elara felt her heart pound in her chest. She glanced at Kieran, who gave her an encouraging smile, though even he seemed tense. One by one, the students stepped forward. Some were gently enveloped by the light, while others flinched back as if it had burned them, but so far, no one had been turned away. Then Elara's name was called. The Trial of Light. With her heart racing, Elara stepped forward. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her and hid her trembling hands. As she approached the fountain, the silvery light grew brighter, almost as if it recognized her. Hesitantly, she reached out and touched the light. The moment her fingers brushed the fountain's silvery surface, she felt as though she were being pulled out of reality. The hall, the other students, the light, all of it vanished, and Elara found herself surrounded by complete darkness. But she was not alone. A voice echoed around her, soft yet penetrating. "Who are you truly?" Elara turned, but she couldn't see anyone. I'm Elara," she said hesitantly. "That is just a name," the voice replied. Who are you in your deepest self? What do you hide from others, from yourself? Suddenly, images appeared before her, floating in the darkness. She saw herself as a child, alone in her room while other children played outside. She saw her mother, hugging her for the last time before disappearing. She saw dreams she couldn't understand and fears that kept her awake at night. The voice spoke again. You carry something within you, something more powerful than you realize. But with power comes danger. Are you ready to face the risks? Alara's throat felt dry, but then she thought of the figure in the hidden archive, the map, and the words in the ancient book. She knew she was here because she sought answers, and she was willing to do whatever it took to find them. I'm ready, she said at last, her voice steadier than she expected. The darkness began to fade, and Elara found herself back in the hall. The silvery light of the fountain now surrounded her completely, warm and protective. A quiet murmur ran through the crowd, and Elara noticed the headmaster watching her with an intense expression, one that held both admiration and caution. A new beginning. After the ceremony, Kieran led her back to the dormitories. He gave her a curious look. The light seemed to like you, he said at last. That doesn't happen often. Elara sensed he wanted to say more, but before she could ask, he stopped and turned to her. Take care of yourself, Elara, he said quietly. The academy is full of wonders, but it's also full of dangers. Elara wanted to respond, but at that moment she felt the weight of the silver pendant in her pocket. She knew he was right. The academy was more than just a place of learning. It was a place of secrets, and she was determined to uncover every single one of them. In the days following the ceremony of lights, Elara began to slowly adjust to life at the academy, as much as one could. The daily schedule was strict but fascinating. Mornings were spent studying the fundamentals of magic and the history of the hidden powers. Afternoons were dedicated to practical exercises, where students learned to control their abilities. But it was the evenings that fascinated Elara the most. After dinner, when the academy was bathed in a soft golden glow, the atmosphere seemed to change. Whispers filled the hallways, shadows stretched longer, and Elara could feel that the academy's walls held secrets, waiting to be uncovered. One night, while the other students were already in their quarters, Elara couldn't sleep. The silver pendant she had found in the chest in her room seemed to pulse, as though calling to her. She picked it up, inspecting it under the moonlight. The tiny engravings on its surface seemed to move, almost as if they were alive. A faint humming filled the room, and suddenly the pendant seemed to pull her in a specific direction. Elara hesitated. Should she really follow it? But her curiosity was stronger. She threw her cloak over her shoulders, tucked the pendant into her pocket, and quietly slipped out of her room. The academy's hallways were dark, but the floating lanterns cast just enough light to illuminate her path. The pendant led her through a part of the school she had never explored before. The corridors grew narrower, the air colder, and soon she found herself standing before a large, ornate door. The same symbol as on her pendant, a key-clutching owl, was carved into the wood. Hesitantly, Elara raised the pendant, and as soon as it touched the door, it creaked open. Beyond lay a room bathed in deep blue and gold light with a strange device at its center. It looked like a massive glass orb surrounded by intricate bronze gears and mechanisms. The air around it buzzed with energy, and a small plaque at the base read, "The Sphere of Memories." Elara stepped closer, cautiously reaching out. As soon as her hand touched the sphere, she was enveloped in a blinding light. Images flooded her mind, images that weren't her own. She saw the academy, but it was different, older, darker. She saw students gathered in a hidden chamber performing mysterious rituals and speaking of a force they called the Source. And then she saw something that made her shiver. A dark figure surrounded by shadows stood at the heart of the academy. Its eyes glowed red, and its voice echoed through the vision. The Source belongs to me. Elara pulled her hand away and stumbled back. Her breathing was rapid, and her hands trembled. What had she just seen? Was it a vision of the past or the future? An alliance in the shadows. The next morning, Elara couldn't shake the vision. She tried to focus in class, but the images haunted her. During a break, she decided to tell Kieran about her discovery. You saw what? Kieran asked, his eyes wide with surprise. The sphere of memories isn't accessible to students. It's only for the Academy's elders. No one even knows exactly how it works. But I saw something, Elara insisted. Something dark, something dangerous. Kieran, I think something is happening in the Academy that no one is noticing. Kieran frowned, then leaned in closer. Okay, listen. There are rumors about a secret group within the Academy. They call themselves the Keepers of the Source, but no one knows who they are or what they're really after. Some say they're protecting us. Others say they have their own agenda. Alara's heart raced. The figures she had seen in the vision had to be the Keepers of the Source. But what was the dark figure she had seen? The first clue. In the days that followed, Elara tried to learn more about the Keepers of the Source. She combed through the library, spoke to other students, and listened to the whispers in the hallways. But the answers remained elusive, and no one seemed to truly know who the Keepers were, or if they even existed. Then, one night, she stumbled upon something unexpected. While sneaking into the library to return a book, she heard soft voices. She hid behind a shelf and peeked out cautiously. 3 figures in dark robes stood before an old, hidden shelf. One of them pulled out a book marked with a symbol Elara immediately recognized, the owl with the key. The time is drawing near, one of the masked figures said. Soon, the source will fully awaken and no one will be able to stop us. What about the elders? Another figure asked. They're growing suspicious. It doesn't matter, the first voice replied. As long as we find the key, the power will be ours. Elara's heart skipped a beat. The key? Could they mean her pendant? But before she could listen further, a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The figures whirled around, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The figures in dark robes froze when they heard the sound. Elara held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the shadows of the shelf. Her heart raced as she tried to remain utterly silent. One of the figures stepped closer, their footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone floor. Someone's here, a low, suspicious voice whispered. We are not alone. Elara knew she would be discovered if she stayed. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and grasped the silver pendant. In her panic, she clutched it tightly, and suddenly, a warm, pulsating energy surged through her body. Before she could comprehend what was happening, the air around her shimmered. She felt as though she were wrapped in an invisible shield, and impossibly, it seemed that she disappeared. The figures turned toward her direction, but their gazes passed over her, as though she weren't there at all. No one's here, one of the figures finally said, their voice laced with irritation. Maybe it was just a mouse. Stay vigilant anyway, another replied. We cannot afford any mistakes. The source is too close. With that, they slid the mysterious book back onto the shelf. A soft click echoed, and the shelf began to rotate, revealing a hidden door behind it. The figures stepped through and vanished into the darkness. Elara waited until the door sealed shut before releasing the pendant. Instantly, the strange, invisible force dissipated, and she became visible once more. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stay calm. The hidden book. Elara stepped cautiously out of her hiding spot and approached the shelf where the figures had disappeared. Her fingers trailed over the rows of books as she searched for the one marked with the owl symbol. When she finally found it, she hesitated only briefly before pulling it from the shelf. Once again, the shelf rotated, and Elara slipped through the hidden door. Beyond it lay a narrow, winding passage dimly lit by flickering torches. The air was cold and heavy, and the only sound was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. Elara followed the passage deeper into the heart of the academy until she reached a chamber that took her breath away. The room was vast, and at its center floated a massive dark orb, surrounded by swirling shadows. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and with each throb, a deep, resonant hum filled the chamber. Around the orb stood the 3 figures from the library. They murmured words in low tones, their voices echoing off the walls. Suddenly, the orb brightened, and Elara saw something that froze her blood. Trapped within the orb was a figure. It was the same dark entity she had seen in the sphere of memories, the one with glowing red eyes. The time is almost upon us, one of the figures said, their voice trembling with reverence. Soon, Our master will be free. Elara could barely process what she was hearing. These figures, the keepers of the source as Kieran had called them, were working to free this dangerous creature, and she knew she had to stop them. Allies in the shadows. The next morning, Elara found Kieran and told him everything she had witnessed. His face turned pale and he shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible," he said. "The source is supposed to be a myth, and even if it's real, no one can free the dark figure. The elders would never allow it." But they are doing it," Elara insisted. "I saw it with my own eyes." Kieran stared at her, his expression growing resolute. "Then we have to do something. But we can't do this alone. We'll need help." Together, they devised a plan. They knew they needed someone who understood the Academy's history and the source better than anyone else. Their only hope was Professor Dervin, an older teacher renowned for his expertise in ancient magic, and one of the few who occasionally defied the elders. In a quiet corner of the library, they approached Dervin and told him everything they had discovered. He listened carefully, his expression growing graver with each passing moment. "You're right," he said at last. "The source is real, and it is dangerous. If the keepers unleash it, the darkness will consume us all. But I fear they are not alone. There are traitors among the elders." Elara and Kieran were stunned. "Traitors? Who?" Elara asked. Dervin shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know they control the Academy from the shadows. If we want to stop them, we must act in secret, and we'll need the key." Elara reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pendant. "Do you mean this?" Dervin's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "It was in my chest when I arrived," Elara said. Dervin examined the pendant closely, murmuring softly. Finally, he spoke. "This is no coincidence. You were chosen, Elara. The key found its way to you, and that means you are the only one who can seal the source." The first mission. With Dervin's guidance, Elara began preparing for a confrontation with the Keepers. She trained her magical abilities, learned ancient protective spells, and studied the history of the source. But time was running out. The Keepers planned to unleash the source during the next lunar eclipse, and it was only a few days away. Elara and her allies worked tirelessly in the few days they had left. Every night, they gathered secretly in the hidden chamber beneath the library, where Professor Dervin had unearthed ancient scrolls and books from the depths of the Academy. These contained powerful protection spells and clues about the ritual needed to reseal the source. "The source is a wound in magic itself," Dervin explained in a low, grave voice. "If fully opened, the dark entity, a primeval being of pure destruction, will be unleashed. Your pendant is the key, Elara, but using it will demand more from you than you can imagine." Elara felt the weight of his words, but she pushed her fear aside. The responsibility was hers now, and she would not back down. The day of the eclipse. The night of the lunar eclipse had arrived. The Academy was cloaked in an eerie silence. The students had retreated to their rooms, while the elders supposedly held a ceremony in the Great Hall. But Elara knew it was only a distraction. Alongside Kieran, Professor Dervin, and two other students she had brought into her confidence, Lysander, a talented protection spellcaster, and Marin, who knew the Academy's hidden passages like the back of her hand, Elara set off for the chamber of the source. Marin led the group through a concealed tunnel behind the greenhouse. The passage was narrow and damp, but they reached the chamber undetected. Through a small opening in the wall, they could see that the keepers of the source had already begun their ritual. The dark orb in the center of the chamber now pulsed more intensely, and the shadows around it seemed alive. The three keepers stood in a circle around the orb, murmuring in a language even Dervin couldn't understand. "We must stop them before the eclipse reaches its peak," Dervin whispered. "Elara, are you ready?" Elara nodded, though she felt far from ready. But before they could act, a loud, deep voice emanated from the dark orb. "Too late," boomed the voice of the dark entity, and the chamber began to tremble. "You cannot stop me." The battle for the source. The keepers of the source noticed Elara and her friends as they stormed into the chamber. One of the masked figures raised their hand, and a massive shadow shot toward the group. But Lysander was prepared. He summoned a protection spell, deflecting the shadow and shielding the group. Kieran focused on the keepers, using his magic to disrupt their positions. "They must not complete the ritual," he shouted. While her friends fought, Elara advanced toward the dark orb. The pendant in her hand began to glow, and she felt it fill her with an overwhelming power. But the closer she got to the orb, the stronger the resistance became. Invisible forces pushed her back, and the dark entity's voice mocked her. "Do you think a mere girl can stop me?" it taunted. "You are weak. Give up." Elara closed her eyes and thought of everything she had learned, the stories Dervin had told her, the support of her friends, and the responsibility she had taken on. "I may be weak," she whispered, but I am not alone." The pendant began to glow brighter, and Elara felt the strength of her allies, Kieran, Lysander, Marin, and even Dervin. Together, they formed a protective circle that enclosed the dark orb and drove back its shadows. The final moment. But the dark entity did not relent. It began to fracture the orb, piece by piece. Shadows whipped through the chamber, and the keepers of the source called desperately for more power. Dervin shouted, "Elara, now!" The pendant must touch the orb. Summoning all her strength, Elara lunged toward the orb. The pendant in her hand now glowed so brightly that it cut through the surrounding shadows. With a final cry, she pressed the pendant against the surface of the orb. A deafening crack filled the chamber, and Elara was engulfed in a wave of light and shadow. She felt the dark entity pushing against her, trying to resist, but the pendant pulsed, drawing the shadows into itself. At last, silence fell. The dark orb was gone, and the keepers of the source lay unconscious on the ground. The end and the beginning. When Elara awoke, she found herself in Dervin's arms. Kieran, Lysander, and Marin stood nearby, their faces filled with relief. "You did it," Kieran said softly. Dervin helped her to her feet. "The source is sealed. The dark entity is gone. You saved the academy, Elara." But Elara didn't feel like a hero. She felt the emptiness left behind by the dark entity and knew this was only the beginning. "I may have stopped it," she said, "but what if it comes back?" Dervin placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then you will be ready, and you won't face it alone." Elara looked at her friends, who smiled at her with unwavering support. In that moment, she knew that as long as they stood together, the darkness would never prevail. The academy was safe again, for now. But in the deepest shadows of the world, something stirred, and Elara knew her adventure was only just beginning.